scientific theories and the tension between empirical data and scientific theories, which I would like to point carefully out to. Now, the creation of scientific theories is actually problematical for the materialists. Materialists are quite comfortable with the entire scientific method, the analysis of data, the collection of data. But the transition from data to laws, which is characteristic of the theoretical sciences, such as physics to a lesser degree chemistry, biology doesn't really fall on this category. This transition is extremely problematical. And I remember a long-term student of Princeton University asking Geshe Japagensi whether he really believed that inferential valid cognizers could be said to be valid cognizers. This is a doubt which is rooted in the materialist doubt. Because for the materialist, as we said at the beginning of this conference, it is the datum of the five senses which describes reality. Anything over and beyond the five senses becomes problematical. It is the black swan. And even an ancient Greek materialist was able to point out the problems in the creation of scientific theories, what is known as induction. Because from the standpoint of a materialist, if you have 1,000 white swans, you cannot on that basis induct that all swans are white, because there is such a thing as a black swan. The materialist, therefore, is uncomfortable with any general principle, any law. This would mean the end, certainly, of the theoretical sciences as we know it. And the same critique of materialism, of induction, is to be found in ancient Indian philosophy. So you can see that this is really something which is organic to materialists. Materialists, whether Greek or Indian, are profoundly uncomfortable with the extraction of general laws from that. As H.R. Vaca, a materialist, said, by repeated observation, this much can be ascertained, that smoke is associated with fire. In other words, where there is smoke, generally there is fire. But it can never be established by repeated observation, that smoke is never present in a place where there is no fire. In other words, from the materialist standpoint, you can have no general rules. From a strict materialist standpoint, mathematics is a game of the imagination, which has no applicability to reality. You cannot extrapolate from observation. You might see a mouse running on the lawn, and a couple of seconds later a cat running afterwards, and see this occur day after day, assuming this is how mice and cats spend their time. But you could never deduce that cats always chase mice, because one day you will see an oversized mouse chasing a cat. This would be the materialist critique of general laws. However many cases you observe of fire, and however many cases you observe of smoke, you can never infer from the present presence of smoke the past presence of fire. This critique has remained latent in much scientific research to the present day. There is a discomfort with theoretical constructs, which is rooted in this. But we do have to address at present the question of what precisely a scientific theory is. No longer merely the process of observation, what is known as a scientific method. But eventually a scientific method must lead to a theory, and this theory must have certain characteristics. And in this field, perhaps the greatest philosopher of science in the 20th century was the American scientist Thomas Kuhn, whose work I will rely heavily upon, and whose main study I will Thomas Kuhn has 5 characteristics of a scientific theory. A scientific theory must be accurate. That's 7. Consistent. Broad in scope as possible. Simple and fruitful. By fruitful, Kuhn means that a scientific theory must lead to more results. Anything which satisfies these 5 criteria is a scientific theory. And we will at present start looking at some scientific theories. And I have tried to keep the science component fairly simple, but as I said, I will be stretching your minds. And after all, we do live in a society whose foremost ideology is science. So it is not illegitimate to refer to science. And I will start by presenting a scientific theory which has been accurate, consistent, broad in scope, simple and fruitful, and to show how eventually this theory encountered data it could not make sense of and had to be abandoned for another theory. This is of profound relevance to us in the context of the impact Buddhism might have on the West in the future. First, I would like to address briefly the impact of mathematization of scientific theories on predictive power. It is seldom pointed out, and I apologize to the scientists among you, but I will put this one as a one thing, that there is a very strong correlation between the predictive power of a scientific discipline and its mathematization. The most heavily mathematized scientific disciplines, such as physics, have the strongest predictive power. They can predict things which were never observed before. The less mathematized a scientific theory is, the less its predictive power. In the case of biology, in which mathematization is very difficult, one basically deals with a statistical analysis of phenomena. Predictive power is extremely weak. What is striking for us is to note that the greater the predictive power and the mathematization of a scientific discipline, the less materialistic and realistic it is. And this is very much the case with modern physics, which, as we will see this afternoon, is really not materialistic and not realistic. The weaker the predictive power of the scientific discipline, the more rooted, if you wish, it is in matter, the more materialistic and realistic it is. And at present, the tremendous influence of biology on popular discourse has led to an exaltation of materialism. And this is something I would like you to keep in mind. I have not included mathematics in this talk, my own training, because mathematics is actually not a science. There is no empirical grounding for mathematics. But I do not know of a single mathematician who is a realist. And I don't know of a single mathematician who is a materialist. Mathematicians typically are idealists and platonists. It's very rare to meet a mathematician who is a coarse materialist a la Richard Gleaned. It just doesn't happen. Pure mathematicians believe in the existence somewhere out there of the theorems you investigate. Then, what precisely is the scope of the scientific method, which has had this huge influence on modernity? Initially, the scope of the scientific method was matter and energy. And this is really the scope of classical science, classical physics, biology, and chemistry. And some developments, like the special theory of relativity, which arose in 1905, which remains rooted in classical physics. Quantum mechanics, of which we will talk this afternoon, has some components which focus on matter and energy. But the scope of scientific investigation has expanded to include non-material phenomena, such as space. And this is very much the scope of Einstein's later work, the general theory of relativity, in which one of the fields, one of the basic fields of physics, the gravitational field, is understood as a curvature of space. And finally, quantum mechanics, which was hugely controversial in its its inception at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, has had to address directly non-material phenomena and their relation to matter and energy. Specifically, and we will talk about this afternoon, quantum physics has had to address directly the relationship between the observer and the observed phenomena. And the question which arose with great strength in the 1920s and early 1930s was what precisely the relationship between the observer and the observed phenomenon meant, and whether some of the quantum laws, such as Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, implied that the observer had to be non-material. In other words, that consciousness not just could be non-material, but had to be non-material. This led to what amounts to a schism in quantum mechanics. Not that dissimilar to the schism in Christianity between Protestantism and Catholicism, with feelings running high on both sides. And it is, as we'll see this afternoon, from quantum mechanics that the strongest evidence of the non-material nature of the mind comes. Evidence which, and that's I will have to stretch you a fair bit this afternoon, so if you drink coffee, have please a strong cup of coffee before this afternoon. Because the data corroborating the non-material nature of the mind in quantum physics is increasing literally by the day. We have articles in Nature, in the Physical Review, which, by leading physicists, which indicate that it is no longer optional to consider mind as a non-material phenomenon. This is of critical importance for us. But what I would like to address is changes in science. Science is seen from the outside as this monolithic phenomenon. It's an endless accretion of data leading to a natural expansion of theories in a harmonious fashion. And I never forget this marvelous old Australian I used to know in Underdale, appropriately called Bob, in his 80s. And we were talking once, and he said, "So what precisely are you?" He used to make furniture, he was a carpenter, he made some furniture. And I said, well, I'm a Tibetan translator, and somewhat of a Buddhist thinker, I suppose. And there was this very big pause. And Bob said, "I see." He said, "I'm a former Anglican, but I believe science will explain it all someday." I hope Bob is still with us. I don't know, he was quite old when I met him. But I think Bob's statement is probably one most people in Australia, and much of the developed world, knows. I'm an ex-Christian, or my family is an ex-Christian family, but basically I feel that we don't fully understand what's going on, but the men in white will provide a clear explanation at some point in the future, and I trust them, as my ancestors basically trusted the priests. And I expect at some point in the future for answers to the mysteries of life. And this is rooted in a vision of science as this monolithic phenomenon with a steady accretion of data and knowledge, and a steady understanding, increasing understanding. This is actually not at all the case in which scientific theories develop, and it is to Thomas Kuhn that we owe this understanding. Thomas Kuhn's background actually is genetics. My knowledge is a biologist, I think, at Harvard University, with no particular interest in the history of science at all. He was, unlike some proponents of scientism, a true working scientist, a man at home in the lab. And he was asked by Harvard to give a conference on the history of science. I gather that nobody else, he sort of fell on the issue. A bit like what happened to me at TBI. I came to translate and I ended up talking about physics. And he figured, I mean, how difficult can it be, right? So he went to Harvard's library and took the works of Aristotle on biology and physics, the metaphysics and physics and the anima on biology. I mean, Aristotle was, after all, the Greek philosopher in the 3rd century BC. He was the father of Western science up to the end of the Middle Ages. And Thomas Kuhn just started reading Aristotle. And this professor at Harvard was shocked by the fact that he simply could not understand what Aristotle was saying. 23 centuries later, a leading American geneticist is unable to understand the worldview of an ancient Greek with a very limited understanding of the world. And this initiated a profound reassessment of the relationship between scientific theories in Thomas Kuhn's mind. And Thomas Kuhn, in turn, developed a 5-phase unfolding, if you wish, of the development of scientific theory. Initially, we have what he called the pre-paradigm phase. Nobody really knows what's going on. There's a lot of data. Everyone's trying to make sense of the data. It's unclear. If you wish, Aristotle's situation when he was trying to connect the data on biology in the ancient world. Plants grow. Doesn't seem to be sexual reproduction among plants. Mammals do seem to have sexual reproduction. And Aristotle just collected the data trying to make sense. Then the normal science phase, in which a theory is erected. However, eventually, this theory comes face to face with data which is incompatible with it. In Aristotle's case, Aristotelian cosmology was geocentric. The Earth was at the center of the universe. Eventually, more and more data indicated that it was the sun which is at the center of the universe. And this led to a crisis in the Aristotelian worldview. This crisis ushers a scientific revolution, and eventually a new paradigm is born. Now, what is critical for us in Kuhn's analysis of the development of scientific models is that it is not the harmonious and gracious unfolding of the knowledge of the universe, which is basically presented in, I would say, the popular understanding of scientific theories. It is crisis-driven. Theories come face to face with data which is profoundly at odds with the theories, and the theories collapse. So initially, one has a situation in which the data on which the paradigm is based, or the theory is based, is integrated into a paradigm which in turn predicts more data. This is, if you wish, the harmonious phase. We are all progressing towards ever greater light and darkness. Until eventually the theory encounters data which is incompatible with the paradigm, and this ushers a situation of crisis. This situation of crisis can last for decades. It may last for even longer. You will see at the end of these conferences, it's my contention, that we have entered a situation of crisis, certainly in physics, in which the data we are dealing with is simply no longer compatible with the worldview we bring with us. But I am leaving a little bit ahead of our topic. And I would therefore like to start with a simple instance of paradigm shift in physics to show you just how dramatic these shifts can be. These are not small differences in outlook. These are huge shifts in worldview, which should greatly temper our naive endorsement of current dogmas in science. And the paradigm shift I would like to address is that between Newton and Einstein, from Newtonian to Einsteinian physics. I'll keep this very simple, don't worry, because it's going to be quite straightforward, but I would like you to see just how major the shift was. For Newton, we live in a rather straightforward world in which speeds and accelerations can be added indefinitely. If, for instance, you have this Mongolian knight riding on his horse, and he shoots, as the Mongolians did, an arrow. It's a great Mongolian specialty, yes, you want to shoot one very Actually, they shot, it's quite interesting. They timed their shooting so that the arrow would be released when the horse was in the air, if you can imagine. It's quite extraordinary. What would be the speed of the arrow the Mongolian horseman shot? Well, it's the speed of the horse, let's say 50 kilometers per hour, plus the speed of the arrow, 300 kilometers per hour, is 350 kilometers per hour. This is Newtonian physics. Speeds can be added. There's nothing particularly mysterious about this. In this case, in 2 dimensions. But the same thing can happen in 3 dimensions. You have 2 objects moving like this. Their speeds relative to each other can be added or subtracted. Nothing complicated, right? That seems self-evident. And then on this basis, Newton developed his famous second law, the amount of force necessary to cause an object to move faster, we know as acceleration, is simply the product of the mass of the object, literally the inertial mass of the acceleration. Again, it's pretty obvious. You have an object weighing 1 kilo. You want to cause its speed to increase to 10 meters per second. In 1 second, you must apply a force of 10 newtons to cause this change in speed. The more force you apply, the faster the object goes. It's pretty evident. All of us think in these terms. And the premises, therefore, of Newtonian physics are, we would say, common sense premises. Mass is constant. What we know as a gravitational field, in other words, the expanse of gravitation. We are in the gravitational field of the Earth. Its transmission is instantaneous. And then Newton did not want to postulate the propagation of these fields in emptiness. He supposed there was some sort of substance in which it propagated, and he called this substance ether. The existence of ether was a dogma in physics up to the beginning of the 20th century. Newton also considered that absolute time exists. In other words, whatever speed you are traveling at the time is the same. This seems pretty evident. We are standing here, and someone is flying to New York. We set our stopwatches at the same time. They will progress in the same way. This is all Newtonian physics. And inertial frames, I won't talk too much about that, can move at any speed with respect to each other. That's a development of the previous point. So the ether postulated by Newton was a sort of thing, you could say this jellyfish, almost insubstantial, which acted as the substance in which gravitation, for instance, or light, moved. Then, I suppose it's an American who always gets to ask the awkward question. 2 American physicists, Nicholson and Boyle, figured if it exists, we can measure it. I suppose it's a very American outlook. And they thought, okay, this is our situation, right? The Earth is moving around the sun. Ether is here. The Earth is moving. So that means that the Earth is crossing the path of ether in this direction. And if we emit a light beam from a single source and split it and have it go in 2 directions, because this light beam is moving through an ether, which is in motion, there should be a shift in frequency in the light. Some of the light's going to go faster because it's moving with the ether, some is going to go slower, it's moving against, or at least, perpendicular to the ether. And when we put them back together, we should have a shift in the light frequency. And then if we can have the shift, we know ether exists. It's logical, right? The problem is, they did this, no shift. Then Nicholson became depressive. I don't know if it's a result of this experiment or because of the stress induced by preparing it, but this is one of the most important experiments in physics because it shows that something which was accepted for 3 centuries actually never existed in the first place. And then we pass from Newtonian physics to Einsteinian physics. Everything shifts in 1905 with 4 papers on achievement. Suddenly, the mass of an object is not a constant. Fields are not instantaneous. Universal time does not exist. And inertial frames cannot move at any speed. And if we contrast these 2 viewpoints, this is what Thomas Kuhn calls a paradigm shift. We pass from classical physics, in which the mass of an object is constant, to relativistic physics, in which it is not a constant, it depends on the speed of the object. We pass from a situation in which fields are instantaneous to one in which they are not. They move at the speed of light. We pass from a situation in which there is this universal substance called ether to one in which there is no such thing. We pass from a situation in which universal or absolute time exists to one in which it does not exist. And we pass finally to a situation in which inertial frames of reference cannot move at any speed. They are limited to motion at the speed of light. This is a paradigm shift. What caused the shift in the paradigm was a Michelson-Morley experiment, where suddenly the theory, Newtonian physics, encountered data which was fundamentally contradictory with itself. It could not integrate this data, and within, my goodness, less than 30 years, a new theory, the special theory of relativity, was created to account for this data. And this paradigm shift was not a particularly harmonious event. There was no internal growth. It was revolutionary. And at present, the compromise to try to salvage Newtonian physics is that Newtonian physics is seen as an approximation of Einsteinian physics at low speeds. At low speeds, significantly beneath the speed of light. Classical physics works. The moment you get to approximately half the speed of light, you cannot ignore relativistic effects. In other words, mass increases. I used to know this one. Mass doubles at 80% of the speed of light. So if you propel an object to 80% of the speed of light, which would be approximately 240,000 kilometers per second, that object's mass doubles. Quite a shift. And this is what Thomas Kuhn meant by the philosophical incommensurability between old and new paradigms. Now, I illustrated it by the case of Aristotle and Copernicus. Aristotle, for whom the world was geocentric, centered on the earth. Copernicus, who initiated the notion of a heliocentric, a solar system centered on the sun. But exactly the same shift occurs between Newton and Einstein. And Kuhn's central point is that once the paradigm has shifted, there is no going backwards. You cannot understand the worldview of a pre-paradigm person. We cannot understand what an Aristotelian thought or how he saw the world. We can study Aristotle's philosophy, his biology, his physics. I met a professor of philosophy at the University of Leiden who was an Aristotelian. And then to my great shock, one of the few times I've been left speechless, he whispered and he said, "I'm ready to accept the existence of impermanence." And I didn't know what to say. He was very nice old gentleman. I didn't want to say anything offensive. I just sort of kept quiet. Perhaps he had really integrated the Aristotelian paradigm. But according to Kuhn, it is not possible. It is not possible to understand how Aristotle thought. And it is no longer possible for us to understand how Newton thought. We are products of the Einsteinian world. So these paradigm shifts are dramatic. They occur when the theoretical system encounters data it can no longer integrate. They are violently resisted by the upholders of the traditional paradigm, until, as Max Planck put it brutally, the upholders of the traditional theoretical systems die out. And this is how the transition from Aristotle's world, with the Earth at its center, and a series of concentric crystalline spheres bearing the planets 55 years is a universe which is incommensurable with Copernicus' universe, a universe we cannot hope to understand. So as Kuhn puts it, the competition between paradigms is not the sort of matter that can be resolved by proofs. So I hope you will see, in the light of the violent shifts in a mathematically grounded discipline like physics, that the view of some of science as a set of certitudes, the new dogma, is profoundly naive and actually unrooted in any type of reality. And I will not name this gentleman, I'm sure you all recognize him. He seems to suffer from hoof and mouth disease. But as Kelly mentions in Irreducible Mind, when current scientific dogma, opinion hardens into dogma, it becomes scientism, which is essentially a type of fundamentalism, a secular theology, and no longer science. I'm not quite sure if he was thinking of somebody when he said this or not, but I am. So I think it is very helpful for us to maintain a mental distinction, a clear mental distinction between science on the one hand and scientism on the other. Science is this collection of data and the constant testing of theories against the data. It occurs in an environment of free investigation, robust free investigation. Scientism is the theology of the 21st century. I mean, as a Buddhist, I often feel that these virulent proponents of scientism, like Richard Dawkins, must be the dogmatic theologians of the 13th century reborn. And they just took the next system around, but the same dogmatism, the same rigidity were present. So what is the worldview which scientism has basically fostered? It is that of man as machine. And this is put quite bluntly by Ken and Malik, a view in which human beings cease to be subjects. They can no longer act on the world. They are merely mechanical parts of the world with the illusion of acting upon the world. This is, I would say, the dominant viewpoint in the life sciences nowadays. If you were to study biology at the University of Ireland, or let's say at ANU, this would be the outlook which would be instilled into you. And this has led some biologists to go one step further and suggest that disciplines such as ethics and philosophy, but perhaps all the humanities, should basically commit a form of collective harakiri and entrust themselves to the kind attention of the sociobiologists. Now, we will have to address the question of what sort of ethics we will end up with in the world of Wilson and Dawkins. And before we go this route, we have to see whether there is data corroborating the materialist outlook which they teach, actually, which they proselytize or not. And all I will present the data from physics and medicine and biology, which is at odds with this afternoon and tomorrow. There is some preliminary data I would like to start presenting to you now. Food for thought, if you wish. Some general arguments against the notion that consciousness is purely immaterial, which is, after all, the main obstacle to any type of spiritual practice a Westerner encounters. And some of these arguments are more rational than others, but some are intuitively very powerful. I think the most powerful intuitively is the private experience of consciousness. Every one of us has an experience of our mind. Now, I may put you in a room with Richard Dawkins alone for 24 hours. I wish such a fate to none of you. But imagining one of you were wicked enough to merit such a fate, I am quite convinced that after 24 hours of such indulgence, your private experience of consciousness will be completely unaffected. And that's a normal 24 hours. You would still be convinced that there is something inside you which thinks, and you would still somehow be convinced it is more than your brain. And this private experience of consciousness has been the focus of philosophical investigation, really, since philosophy came to its own with the Greek philosophers in the 5th century BC and the Indian philosophers approximately at the same period. There is a second argument, which again is not so much a direct argument against the material nature of consciousness as an argument which raises issues the material account of consciousness cannot account for. It's the paradoxes of altruism and empathy. We are, as it were, brainwashed to believe that nature is, as a friend of mine put it, red in tooth and claw. That the world outside our windows is a savage world. And that this savagery is indispensable for the selection of the strongest and the transmission of their genes. All of us, whether we know so or not, are heavily influenced by rather basic Darwinism. It's of interest that at the very period during which Darwin developed his theory of evolution, one of the most famous Russian scientists of the age, who's now better remembered as a leading anarchist, Prince Pyotr Kropotkin, some of my favorite reading as a teenager, developed an entirely different outlook of nature, in which he saw nature as a cooperative venture. A venture in which creatures cooperated with each other unless it was unavoidable for conflict to arise. And lest you think that this is naive and unrealistic, much research in primate ethology, especially the research of Van der Waal, has confirmed Kropotkin's work. Van der Waal, Holland's, I forget if he's Dutch or Belgian, Dutch, I think, leading primatologist, had dedicated his life to the study of primate behavior and has found massive evidence of altruism and empathy among primates. Now, altruism and empathy are actually the foremost obstacle to the theory of evolution, and this was recognized by Darwin himself. It's not a minor obstacle. Darwin was fully aware of the existence of empathy in the animal world, and obviously its existence in human beings as well. And empathy and altruism are totally incompatible with a world of the struggle and survival of the fittest. I mean, if any of you have ever read Ayn Rand's books, an American author who basically has written novels based on social Darwinism, nobody seems to have any empathy in Ayn Rand's books. It's quite striking. Now, altruism is present throughout all the strata of biology. We find it, for instance, in both ants and bees. We find behavior in ants and bees which is quite striking, in which the individual ant or bee will sacrifice itself for the community. And traditionally, this sacrifice is explained by a technical term called haploidiploidy, which amounts to saying that the ant or the bee which sacrifices its life gains nonetheless genetic benefit through the survival of the queen, for instance, which can do more to transmit its genetic material than it could alone. It sounds complicated, and frankly it is complicated and perhaps rather contrived. Unfortunately, there are now a substantial number of insect and vertebrate communities in which altruistic behavior has been demonstrated and in which the argument of haploidiploidy does not hold. And even among insects just very recently, some 6 years ago, a study found instances of preemptive suicide for the defense of the community among Brazilian forest ants, which is quite astonishing. What the ant does is that it shields the hole leading to the anthill with its own body before dusk sets to protect the anthill from anteaters and other predators. It does not protect the anthill during an attack. It protects it before the attack occurs and sacrifices its own life in the process because it does not survive until the morning. Now, this case is astonishing. It's the first case of preemptive suicidal defense of a community. It is difficult to account for such cases without supposing some type of foresight needed. Now, such foresight is unacceptable to contemporary biology. So arguments have been found to try to preclude it. But altruism is also evinced among higher mammals, specifically a mammal I'm sure you have never heard about, the naked mole rat of Somalia. And in this case, this particular case, haplodiploidy can explain it to a degree because the community is highly inbred. Because they are highly inbred, the sacrifice of one of the naked mole rats, if it enables the queen to survive, does enable the transmission of the genetic material to the queen. However, when we come to altruism among primates, the arguments from haplodiploidy collapse. Altruism is widespread among all primates, such as the vervet monkey. And yet, the communities are not heavily inbred. And therefore, the vervet monkey who sacrifices himself for the community gains no genetic benefit. His own genetic material is not transmitted. Keep in mind, this is Dawkins's key point here. Dawkins's key point in the selfish gene is that the gene itself ensures its survival at the expense of the individual. That's the crux of his argument, some 500-600 pages. The behavior of primates, especially in communities which are not heavily inbred, counters this. And this behavior is now very well documented by Van der Waal and others. Then I will skip the Darwinian rationales for altruism and pass to human altruism. In the case of human altruism, the situation becomes even more embarrassing. And evolutionary biologists are forced to view every single case of human altruism as a case of maladaptation, where the individual behaves altruistically through being misled, if you wish, by his genes. Because after all, if Gandhi fasts for India as a community is basically not genetically related to Gandhi, or so mostly it makes no difference. Were Gandhi to die from this fast, Gandhi's genes would derive no benefit at all. And the case of Mother Teresa is even more extreme. It becomes impossible to account for some of the most magnificent aspects of human behavior with sociobiology. And therefore, Wilson's idea that ethics could be safely entrusted to biologists seems like nonsense, utter nonsense. Because behavior such as self-sacrifice, non-violence, asceticism, and ideas such as universal altruism are ideas which have no place whatsoever if human behavior is a byproduct of evolutionary need. But the arguments against a Darwinian account of behavior go much further. Because one does have to address the issue of empathy. And empathy has no raison d'être in a Darwinian model of life. Empathy is a feeling of compassion or relatedness we have for another, and it is attested in most mammals, and even in non-vertebrates, as I shall mention later. In the case of rats, for instance, empathy has been studied very carefully since the 1960s. And there is clear data showing that rats when they see another rat suffering, suffer themselves, and experience tremendous stress as a result of the suffering of another rat, which does not affect them physically in the slightest. Such empathy is very difficult to account for in a Darwinian context. Actually, it's very difficult to account for in biology, period. There's no evolutionary rationale for it. And the reaction of rats when another rat is tortured, which is basically what some of these American experiments involve, is a reaction of extreme stress, in which eventually the rat withdraws in a corner, shuddering and squeaking. A Buddhist would say, why precisely is there such resistance to seeing rats as persons in the full sense of the term? And if they are persons, what are we doing with persons? But it's a clear sign of the blindfolds we as a society have that this viewpoint is never evoked. Empathy has even been demonstrated very recently among ants. And it's quite puzzling. You will see how guarded the author of the article, Karen Hollis, is in her abstract. She really has to tread on eggs.